Some stories don't begin with a bang. They begin with silence and the soft thump of an old dog's heart still beating against time. Welcome to Vale Marks, where we tell stories that aren't just heard, but felt. This is not just a tale about a war veteran or a misunderstood pit bull. It's a journey about loss, healing, and the invisible threads that bind broken souls together. Sometimes the smallest things take up the most room in your heart, said A. A. Milne, and tonight that truth comes alive. Watch till the very end, because the lesson hidden within may just stay with you forever. Every afternoon, just as the sun began to sink behind the low rooftops of the East Atlanta neighborhood, Walter Harris could be found in the same spot, on the creaking wooden porch of his weather-worn home, sitting in a faded rocker that had long since stopped squeaking with every sway. The air around him was thick with silence, the kind that doesn't press down but seeps in. People in the neighborhood had grown used to the sight of the old man in the army jacket, his silver-white beard catching the last golden rays like frost on a battlefield. What most didn't notice, though, was what he stared at each evening with that heavy, unspoken reverence. A short, rusted length of chain nailed to the wall just above the porch steps. That piece of chain, dull with age and speckled with rust, had once held something powerful, not in the way people often feared, but in the way memory holds weight. It had belonged to Bronx, the dog now lying quietly at Walter's feet like a living shadow. For strangers, Bronx looked like any other aging mutt. Brown coat tinged with gray, body leaner than it should be, his right hind leg dragging ever so slightly with each step. But Bronx wasn't just any dog, and Walter wasn't just any man. The two had history written not in words, but in scars, some visible, others buried deep beneath the skin. Walter had served 3 tours overseas, most of them spent under skies that never promised a tomorrow. He rarely talked about it, not with neighbors, not with the occasional volunteer who came by to check his medicine cabinet. But Bronx had been there. Not just metaphorically, he had been there. Assigned to Walter's unit as a military working dog during their final deployment, Bronx had once torn through barbed wire and chaos to drag Walter out of a burning vehicle, ignoring flames and gunfire, driven by a loyalty that went beyond instinct. They had both nearly died that day. Only one of them had come home with a purple heart. Bronx, though, had come home with something more enduring, Walter's complete and unquestioned trust. Now, years later, the war felt like another life. But the bond remained. Bronx wasn't big. He didn't have the imposing bulk people associated with pit bulls. His body was compact, tightly built, but worn from time and pain. He moved slowly, deliberately, his limbs stiff from old injuries. But when he turned his head and looked at Walter, there was no mistaking the intelligence in those eyes. They were calm, alert, and startlingly human in moments of stillness, eyes that had seen too much, lost too much, and yet still watched the world with a quiet, determined grace. Sometimes kids from the block would ride by on bikes and slow down when they saw the dog. "Is he mean?" they'd ask from the sidewalk. Walter would shake his head without looking away from the street. "Only if you're an idiot," he'd mutter. It was his way of saying Bronx wasn't dangerous unless he had to be, which these days he rarely did. The world Bronx guarded now wasn't a war zone. It was an aging man's solitude, a creaking porch, a rusted chain, and memories that came and went like autumn wind through the broken screen door. Bronx rarely barked. He didn't chase squirrels or react to loud noises. He didn't even flinch when thunder rolled across the sky. What he did do every single day was rise from his spot beside Walter and patrol the edge of the porch, his gait uneven but still purposeful. He would pause near the corner, stare into the quiet street for a long moment, then settle again near the stairs. Some days, it looked like he was waiting for something, or someone. Walter noticed it. Of course he did. He also noticed how Bronx sometimes twitched in his sleep, as if running in dreams, chasing echoes of the past. And he saw how the dog's breathing had grown more labored in recent months, how he sometimes had trouble lying down without whimpering softly. Bronx never asked for comfort. He didn't know how to beg. But Walter, in his own quiet way, had begun preparing for what he knew was coming. He'd cleaned the chain on the wall, repolished Bronx's old service tag, and even written a few words on a folded piece of paper he kept in the front pocket of his flannel shirt. Just in case. What was perhaps most heartbreaking about watching Walter and Bronx sit together wasn't the obvious aging or the silence they kept, but the sheer stillness between them. It was the kind of stillness that only comes from people who no longer feel the need to fill the air with talk. A stillness built on knowing. Bronx didn't have to look up to sense when Walter's breath caught remembering something painful, and Walter didn't have to ask when Bronx's legs trembled just before standing. Some would say Bronx was too old now to matter, that he was just a dog on borrowed time. But Walter knew better. Bronx was a soldier, a survivor, a companion who had never let go, even as the world moved on without them. And if that rusted chain on the porch wall was any symbol, it wasn't one of captivity. It was a reminder that some bonds never break, even when everything else does. And so, each evening, under the fading light of a tired Georgia sky, Walter sat in silence, Bronx at his feet, chain on the wall, no music, no noise, just the low creak of the rocker and the whisper of a past that refused to be forgotten. In that simple space, something sacred lived, and if you were quiet enough, if you truly listened, you could almost hear it breathe. Friday evening arrived like a slow exhale, the kind that empties not just the lungs but something deeper, some unseen reservoir of hope, of denial, of all the things a man doesn't want to face. The sky over East Atlanta dimmed into a soft amber as streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the uneven pavement. Inside the weathered house on the corner, the air felt heavier than usual. Walter Harris sat hunched over on the edge of the couch, both hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea he hadn't taken a sip from in over an hour. The television murmured low in the background, something about rain rolling in, but Walter wasn't listening. In front of him, lying on an old plaid blanket folded into a makeshift bed, was Bronx. The dog's breathing was steady but shallow. His sides rose and fell with slow, measured effort, each breath a reminder that time was a currency now in short supply. His eyes remained open, soft brown, ringed with a glaze of age, but no less aware. He looked at Walter the way he always had, not with pity or panic, but with that same quiet knowing that had earned him a place beside a soldier's side all those years ago. The vet had been cleared. "He's tired, Mr. Harris. His organs are slowing down. He's in pain, whether he shows it or not. We can help him go peacefully. When you're ready." Walter had nodded. He hadn't argued. After all these years, after all they'd seen and survived together, he owed Bronx a departure free of suffering. So he scheduled it for Saturday morning. Just one more night. That night. Walter rose slowly from the couch and walked over to the shelf above the fireplace. There, resting atop a faded American flag folded into a triangle, was the rusted piece of chain. The same chain Bronx had once snapped while dragging Walter away from the burning wreck of their Humvee. The same chain that had once represented order, control, duty. Now it was something else entirely. A relic of survival, of loyalty beyond comprehension. He picked it up, felt the weight of it in his hand, then walked back to the blanket and sat cross-legged beside Bronx. The old Pitbull didn't move much, but his ears gave the slightest twitch. Walter reached out and placed a hand gently on the dog's back, stroking the matted fur slowly. "You know," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost apologetic, "it wasn't because you were a Pitbull that I chose you." Bronx blinked once, then turned his head ever so slightly toward the man. "It was your eyes," Walter continued. You looked at me like you already knew what I'd lost. Like you'd lost it too. And somehow, that made it bearable. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Outside, wind stirred the leaves on the porch. The rain hadn't come yet, but it was near. Walter's hand slowed. His fingers came to rest on Bronx's side. He sat like that for a long time, his gaze lost in the ridges of the chain still cradled in his lap. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he said, "Tomorrow, buddy. We'll rest tomorrow." But Bronx didn't rest. His body remained still, but his eyes stayed fixed on the door. His ears lifted slightly, just enough to catch something unseen. Walter noticed it, just barely, a flicker of attention, a subtle tension in the dog's muscles. "You hear something?" Walter asked, gently, though he already knew Bronx wasn't listening to him. The old Pitbull stared toward the screen door as though there were voices outside that only he could hear. Not voices of danger. Bronx no longer responded to every rustle like a young guard dog, but something different, something that tugged at the deepest part of him. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was memory, or maybe, just maybe, it was purpose, because Bronx didn't lie back down. With slow determination, he shifted his weight, groaning softly as he pushed up onto his front legs. Walter leaned forward, alarmed. Hey now, what are you doing?" he whispered. "You should be resting. Come on, we've got one more night." But Bronx wasn't staying. Step by step, with the kind of stubborn courage that defined his entire life, Bronx made his way to the front door. His nails clicked softly on the floor, his breath catching slightly with the strain. Walter didn't stop him. He watched, heart tightening, as Bronx paused at the threshold, glanced back for a single heartbeat, then nudged the door open with his snout. The wind had picked up. Leaves blew across the front yard in scattered spirals. Streetlights flickered as if unsure whether to keep burning. And Bronx stepped out into the night, not with the energy of a young dog, not with urgency, but with conviction. Walter remained frozen on the floor, eyes locked on the open doorway. He didn't call out, didn't chase. He just sat there, staring into the darkness beyond the porch, feeling something shift inside his chest, a dull ache, familiar yet sharp, as if a thread had snapped, one so deeply woven into his being that he hadn't even realized it was still connected. Until now. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of questions, of fears, of things unsaid. Walter felt his own breath grow unsteady as he gripped the piece of chain tighter in his hands. Something had changed. He couldn't name it yet. But in that moment, in the hush that settled after Bronx's departure, Walter realized what he had always feared most wasn't losing the dog. It was losing what the dog knew about him. Because Bronx had been there for everything Walter had never dared to say out loud. The grief, the guilt, the long nights filled with names of men who never made it home. Bronx had seen it all and loved him anyway. Now the dog was gone, not far, not yet, but something in the way the night swallowed him made it feel final. Walter rose slowly and walked to the open door. The porch was empty, the rocking chair still. He stepped outside, clutching the chain. Somewhere in the distance, a faint noise stirred, something between a breath and a whisper. He listened, and for a split second, he could swear he felt it, not in his ears, but in his chest. Bronx was answering a call, not from war, not from memory, but from someone small and lost and needing to be found. And Walter knew this wasn't their last night. Not yet. Just a few houses down from Walter's porch, in a cramped second-floor apartment with peeling paint and broken blinds, 9-year-old Luna sat on the edge of her bed, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. The TV in the next room buzzed with static. Her stepmother had fallen asleep on the couch again, a bottle half empty beside her, snoring over the remnants of another microwaved dinner. The apartment smelled faintly of burnt cheese and cheap detergent, and Luna hated that smell more than anything. It wasn't bad, exactly. It was forgettable, just like her. She hadn't spoken much in the months since her father died. There hadn't been a funeral, not the kind she could understand. Just a folded flag, some soft words she didn't really hear, and then silence. He had been a construction worker, always coming home with tired eyes and sawdust in his beard, always bringing her something, a lollipop from the gas station, a sticker, or just a warm hug. And then one day, he didn't come home at all. A scaffolding failure, they said. An accident. No one to blame. After that, Luna's world had folded in on itself. Her stepmother, Renee, tried, maybe in the beginning, but it didn't take long for the frustration to grow. Renee had never signed up to raise a child alone, especially not one that didn't talk, didn't smile, didn't cry. Luna became another chore on a growing list, another shadow in a small apartment that already felt too crowded with grief no one had the words to name. Renee didn't hit her, but sometimes the coldness in her voice felt sharper than a slap. Luna had learned to be quiet, to be small, to not ask for seconds or speak during commercials. She drew pictures in the margins of her homework, stared at the ceiling while lying on the carpet, and hugged her teddy bear, the same worn little bear her dad had given her on her 5th birthday. His stitching had come loose in one arm, and one of his button eyes was chipped. But he still smelled faintly of old flannel and dust and home. That night, the wind outside whispered through the cracked window pane like an invitation. It wasn't loud or angry. It was soft, almost curious, and something inside Luna stirred, not a thought, really, but a feeling. A longing she hadn't let herself recognize in weeks. She got up quietly, careful not to let the floorboards creak, and slipped her shoes on without socks. The teddy bear went into her backpack, along with a small flashlight and a bag of unopened potato chips she'd hidden in the closet behind her winter coat. She opened the door slowly, holding her breath, and then slipped into the hallway. The front door groaned slightly when it opened, but no one stirred, not even the TV. Outside, the night air was cool, brushing against her face like a whisper she couldn't quite hear. The neighborhood was hushed, only the occasional bark of a distant dog or the rattle of trash in the wind. Luna walked with purpose, not fast, but like she already knew where she was going. Her feet took her down the sidewalk, past houses with lit windows and porches with potted plants, toward the edge of the block where the concrete ended and the fence around the old factory grounds began. She'd only been there once, a long time ago, when her dad took her to see where he used to work before joining the crew. He'd pointed to the rusting metal beams and the towers with broken glass and told her stories about how buildings were like puzzles, how every bolt mattered. She remembered him lifting her up to see through one of the chain-link holes in the fence, his arms warm and steady. She had felt tall then, safe. Now she ducked under the gap in the fence where the chain had long since rusted away. No one came here anymore. The building was condemned, the whole lot forgotten. But it didn't feel scary. It felt like something left behind. Like her. She made her way past weeds taller than her knees, past old tires and broken signs, and finally crawled into one of the rusted shipping containers near the back of the lot. It smelled like iron and dust and rain. She liked it. It was quiet, honest. The walls didn't echo with yelling or TV noise. Here, she didn't have to pretend she was okay. She didn't have to pretend to be invisible. Because here, there was no one to see her. She sat in the corner, pulled her teddy bear out of the bag, and curled up around him. She didn't cry. Luna didn't do that anymore. She just stared at the opposite wall, her small fingers absently tracing the bear's worn seams. Her eyes stayed wide open, watching the shadows dance, listening to the wind rattle the edges of the container like soft drumming. It wasn't cold, not really, but she shivered anyway. maybe out of habit. She hadn't run away to get attention. She hadn't run away out of anger. Luna had just needed space. A place where her father's memory still felt real, where she could exist without disappointing anyone. A place where no one looked at her like a broken thing that couldn't be fixed. She wasn't trying to be brave. She was just trying to feel like she mattered. And as the wind howled a little louder outside, somewhere in the distance, a sound stirred. Not quite a bark, not quite a growl. Just something moving through the night, drawn by the quiet sadness of a little girl and the stillness of a place that no one else remembered. Luna didn't hear it yet, but she would. Soon. The rain began as a whisper, a soft drizzle that misted the empty streets and softened the rusted edges of the forgotten industrial lot. Most people had already retreated indoors. Porch lights blinked through the mist like tired eyes, and the wind curled around corners as if searching for something, or someone, left behind. Bronx moved slowly, his gait uneven but determined. The aging Pitbull weaved through puddles and patches of overgrown weeds, nose low to the ground, ears twitching at every subtle shift in the air. His coat, once sleek and strong, was now patchy and damp, clinging to his frame like a threadbare coat. But he didn't stop, didn't hesitate. Something was guiding him forward, not a sound, not a command, but the faintest trace of human scent carried on the night wind. It was thin, like the memory of a voice, but Bronx followed it like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. He passed the corner store, the flickering sign casting a pale green hue over the sidewalk. He paused once, briefly, when a car passed at a distance, headlights scanning across the fence near the edge of the factory lot. Then he continued, silent as shadow, stepping through a familiar hole in the chain-link fence. His paws sank into the mud, but he barely noticed. Inside the lot, the world felt even quieter. The rain tapped on broken glass, on dented steel, on old shipping containers lined up like forgotten memories. Bronx moved toward one of them instinctively, his nose twitching faster now. The scent was stronger here, young, human, frightened, but not panicked, just alone. He found her curled up in the far corner of a rust-stained container, knees to her chest, head resting on a worn-out teddy bear. Her jacket was zipped all the way up, hood pulled low, shoes wet from the walk. Luna didn't flinch when he appeared. She didn't scream, didn't back away. She simply lifted her head slowly, her wide eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Bronx didn't bark. He didn't growl or whimper. He simply stepped inside, carefully, and lay down a few feet away from her. The container echoed with the sound of his breathing, the occasional shake of his wet fur. He turned his head just slightly, and, with gentle purpose, rested his chin on the corner of her jacket, just enough for her to feel the weight of his presence, nothing more. Luna stared at him, at first uncertain. Then, something changed. She didn't move away. She didn't even blink. Her small hands tightened around her teddy bear, but her shoulders relaxed, just a little. She studied him, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. Who was this old, soaked creature who had found her in the dark? Minutes passed. The rain outside grew steadier, drumming on the metal roof in soft waves. It wasn't loud enough to scare her, just steady enough to remind her of the world continuing on, even when it felt like everything had stopped. Then, slowly, Luna stretched out a hand. She didn't stroke his fur. Not at first, just placed her hand, gently, on his side. Bronx didn't react. He didn't tense up. He didn't shift away. He simply remained where he was, warm and still, letting her touch him like he had been waiting for it all along. Her fingers moved slowly, tracing the damp fur along his ribs. She could feel the age in him, the way his breathing sometimes caught, the way his bones pressed closer to the skin than she expected. And still, he stayed. It wasn't comfort in the traditional sense. Bronx didn't try to cheer her up. He didn't perform tricks or nuzzle against her for affection. He simply offered her the one thing she hadn't felt in a very long time: presence. A calm, steady weight that anchored her in that space, reminding her she wasn't invisible. And for Luna, that meant more than anything. No one had sat beside her without expecting something, not since her dad. Not since bedtime stories and late-night cocoa and jokes about how bears snored louder than dads did. Since then, it had all been silence and scolding. The quiet in this container was different. It didn't judge, it didn't push, it just allowed her to be. Luna exhaled deeply and let her head fall back against the wall. Her fingers stayed lightly on Bronx's side. The bear rested in her lap, and the warmth from Bronx slowly seeped into her legs, chasing away the damp chill. He wasn't going to leave her. She could tell. That understanding didn't need words. It didn't need promises. It was in the way Bronx had found her. Without calling, without searching for praise, he had simply come. And now, he stayed. The wind picked up for a moment, sending a low howl through the broken windows nearby. Bronx raised his head slightly, ears twitching, then lay it back down. Luna smiled, not a wide smile, not even a happy one. Just a small, honest curve of her lips, the first in a long, long time. She didn't know his name yet, and he didn't know hers. But in that quiet, forgotten container, two souls, each carrying the weight of things they couldn't explain, had found shelter, not from the rain, not just from the night, but from something deeper, from the kind of loneliness that only recognizes itself in another. Morning arrived slowly, slipping through the clouds with a light gray hush. The rain had stopped, but the world still wore its dampness like a heavy coat. In the distance, a single crow called out, breaking the silence of a neighborhood just waking up. Walter Harris stood at the edge of the factory lot, squinting past the rusted fencing, his breath catching in his chest. He had followed the directions of a wide-eyed boy from next door who said he'd seen the old dog wandering toward the abandoned buildings the night before. Pretty sure he was chasing something, the boy had shrugged. Or maybe following someone. Now Walter moved slowly, his boots crunching through gravel and puddles, eyes scanning for any sign. When he reached the row of shipping containers tucked behind a crumbling wall, he stopped. His gaze landed on a small pair of sneakers poking out from the open end of one container. He approached without a word. Inside, curled together like they'd known each other forever, were Bronx and Luna. The girl was asleep. One arm draped loosely over the dog's side, her teddy bear pressed between them. Bronx's head rested on her lap, eyes half closed, body still but alert, breathing in sync with hers, as if guarding her dreams. Walter didn't speak right away. He just stood there, hands trembling slightly at his sides. Then he knelt beside them and whispered, almost to himself, "One more soul, huh? You found another one to save." Bronx didn't move, but his eyes shifted, just briefly, to meet Walter's. The look said enough. Later that morning, after a quiet walk home and some awkward conversation with a surprised and exasperated stepmother, Walter made an offer. "She can stay for a few days," he said, "just till she feels steady again." Renee hesitated, but finally agreed, more out of convenience than concern. And so, Luna came to stay. At first, she said little. She followed Bronx like a shadow, keeping close but quiet. Walter noticed how Bronx would lie across doorways, always positioning himself between Luna and the outside. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he simply stayed. Always. Luna started calling him Rusty. It began one afternoon when she sat beside him on the porch, her hands playing with the fur along his back. "Your coat looks like old pennies," she said softly. "And your eyes. They look like they've seen the whole world and didn't get scared." She smiled to herself. Rusty Fitz. The name stuck. In the days that followed, something shifted in the house. Walter, who once avoided speaking unless absolutely necessary, found himself telling old stories about his time overseas, about the dog he trained before Bronx, about how he used to make popcorn in a skillet because his wife said the bagged stuff was cheating. Luna listened, not always with words, but with the stillness of someone who finally felt safe enough to be still. They roasted corn over the stove, fed Rusty scraps under the table, and sat on the front porch in the evenings while the neighborhood moved slowly around them. Walter gave Luna a book, an old paperback mystery, and she devoured it in 2 days. The next morning, she asked if he had more. That was the first full sentence she'd said to him. At night, Luna sometimes woke up crying, her breath catching in her chest before the sound ever reached her throat. And every time, without fail, Rusty was there, already standing, already climbing onto the edge of her makeshift cot to curl up beside her. He didn't lick her face or paw at her like some dogs might. He just lay beside her, warm and steady, like a stone placed gently over a wound to keep it from bleeding. Walter often watched from the hallway, heart full in ways he didn't have words for. He'd been alone so long, he'd forgotten what it was like to care where the sound of laughter came from. But now, in that creaky little house with the crooked fence and peeling porch, there was something new. Not loud, not sudden, just present. It wasn't that everything was healed. Luna still had shadows under her eyes. Rusty still limped. Walter still spoke more to ghosts than to people some days. But now, when the wind blew across the yard, it didn't sound so hollow. When the sun broke through the blinds in the morning, it fell across more than just dust. There was warmth now, and in its quiet way, it filled the spaces they each thought would stay empty forever. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment, the night was quiet, still and humid, the air holding its breath. The next, the sky cracked open with a rumble deep enough to shake window panes and wake old bones. Thunder growled low over the neighborhood, a warning that something wasn't right. Inside Walter's home, the wind rattled the loose boards on the back porch and whistled through the screen door. Rain tapped against the windows in hurried patterns, and the old ceiling fan above the living room swayed slightly in its frame. Walter stirred in his recliner, half asleep, his hands still resting on the open pages of a book he hadn't read in hours. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the silence outside. The storm had erased that, but the silence inside. No breathing near the hallway door, no shifting weight, no soft click of claws against hardwood. Bronx wasn't there. Then came the chill. Not from the rain or the wind, but from the sudden realization that something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Walter pushed himself to his feet, blinking against the pull of age and sleep. "Bronx?" he called softly. No answer. He checked the front porch. Empty. Checked Luna's room next. The cot was rumpled, the blanket tossed aside, the window was open, and the little girl was gone. Walter's heart skipped, his breath caught. For a second, he couldn't move. Then he grabbed his flashlight and coat, his hands trembling not just from fear, but from something worse, recognition. A deep, awful knowing in his gut. Luna had gone back to the one place where ghosts still felt close. The factory. Outside, the rain came down harder. Water streamed in rivulets along the curbs, and the streets shimmered with the pale orange light of the few working lamps. Walter moved as fast as he could, coat flapping, boots splashing through puddles. Each gust of wind hit like a shove to the chest, and still he ran, flashlight bouncing in his hand. At the edge of the abandoned lot, the storm seemed louder, meaner. The rusted gate creaked open with a metallic groan. Walter slipped through the gap in the chain link, his breath catching in short, painful bursts. Somewhere beyond the shipping containers, in the wet chaos of metal and weeds, a gunshot cracked through the air. Sharp, sudden, terrifying. Walter froze. His flashlight dropped. "No!" he whispered, voice shaking. "No, no, no!" In the shadows of the old lot, a man stood hunched under the overhang of a broken awning, eyes wide, a rusted revolver shaking in his hand. He was drenched, rainwater mixing with nerves, muttering under his breath. "Didn't mean to. I thought it was wild. I didn't. He was just there. Dark out. I didn't know." Walter didn't stop for him. He stepped past the man, deeper into the yard. Flashlight retrieved and beam trembling as it searched for familiar shapes in the rain. Then he saw it. A small figure, curled near the base of one of the containers, half submerged in muddy water. Luna. And on top of her, shielding her with his body, was Bronx. The old dog's coat was slick with rain and streaked with red. Blood spread like ink through the puddles around him. His ribs rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His head was low, ears barely moving, but his eyes were open, locked on Walter. Walter fell to his knees beside them, hands hovering over Bronx, but too afraid to touch. "Oh, God," he breathed. "Bronx, what have you done?" Luna stirred beneath the dog, face pale, soaked, her lips trembling. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to see Walter. He found me," she whispered, barely audible. "He came back." Walter reached for her, pulling the blanket from his pack and wrapping it around her shaking form. Bronx didn't move. He stayed right where he was, his body curved protectively over her, tail barely twitching in the cold. Walter looked into Bronx's face. It wasn't panic he saw. It wasn't fear. It was resolve. "You stubborn, beautiful fool," Walter choked. He placed a trembling hand on Bronx's shoulder. "You're not done yet, soldier. You hear me?" The Bronx blinked once, slowly. His breathing shuddered, but his eyes stayed on Walter. "You're not going anywhere," Walter said, more firmly now, as if by sheer will he could keep the dog tethered to this earth. "Not tonight. Not yet. You've still got someone counting on you." The rain poured around them like a curtain, drowning out the rest of the world. But in that small pocket of light and breath and blood and love, time seemed to pause. Walter scooped Luna gently into his arms, careful not to jostle her too much. Then, with great effort, he bent to lift Bronx. The dog whimpered once, sharp, high, but didn't resist. It took everything Walter had to get them both home. Each step through the storm was heavier than the last, but he kept moving. Kept whispering to Bronx, kept promising. "You saved her. Now let me save you." By the time they reached the house, the sun was just beginning to rise, a pale blush behind the storm clouds. The porch light flickered weakly. Walter's arms ached, his legs trembled, but Bronx was still breathing, just barely. Later, as the vet worked to stop the bleeding and Luna slept on the couch wrapped in warm towels, Walter sat beside Bronx on the floor, hand resting on the dog's chest. He looked at the collar, now broken where the chain used to hang, the same chain that had once represented duty and control, now snapped loose, resting beside a dog who had long outgrown any leash. "You're still here," Walter said softly. "Still fighting." Bronx didn't move, but his tail gave a single, quiet thump, and that was enough. Spring arrived gently that year, as if it, too, understood that this little corner of the world had been through enough. The mornings were warmer now, with sunlight spilling like honey across the front porch of Walter Harris's old house. The air smelled of fresh grass and damp wood, of quiet beginnings and things finally allowed to rest. Bronx had survived. The bullet wound had taken a toll, more than any of them expected, but he pulled through, stubborn as ever. He could no longer walk on his own, not really. His back legs, weakened by age and trauma, no longer held his weight. But he didn't need to move much. Not here. Not in the place that had finally become home. Walter had built a small ramp from the porch to the yard, sanded smooth and painted blue. Bronx now spent most of his days lying in the sun, his head resting on an old pillow, ears twitching at passing birds, eyes soft and half-closed. His days of running and guarding were behind him, but in the eyes of those who knew him, Bronx had nothing left to prove. One weekend, about a month after the storm, Walter and Luna hosted a small gathering. Not a funeral, not a goodbye, but something else entirely. They called it Misunderstood Heroes Day. There were no speeches or banners, just a folding table covered in lemonade and cookies, a few neighbors standing quietly in the grass, and Bronx lying on a blanket in the middle of it all, a red bandana tied gently around his neck. Walter spoke only once. He stood beside Bronx, looked at the small group gathered, and said, "Some folks see a Pitbull and think trouble, but this one saved 2 lives, and he never asked for anything in return." That was all. People came forward slowly. One by one, they sat beside Bronx, shared stories, offered pats, shed quiet tears. A teenager from down the block admitted he'd once thrown rocks at dogs, but not anymore. An elderly woman brought a jar of homemade peanut butter treats. A man Walter had never seen before knelt and whispered, "He reminds me of my old dog. Thank you for letting us know him." Luna had drawn a sign and taped it to the porch railing. In colorful, uneven letters it read, "Not broken, just brave." Bronx didn't understand the words, but he felt the love. He always had. By the time the sun dipped low, the guests were gone, and the yard was quiet again. Bronx lay beside Luna on the porch, her sketchbook balanced on her knees as she shaded in the outline of a dog beneath a wide Georgia sky. The drawing wasn't perfect. His legs were a little too long, his ears a little too round, but it was filled with something truer than detail: warmth. Walter was in the yard, pushing an old mower across the patchy grass, his hat tilted back and a half-smile on his face. For a man who had spent years waiting for nothing, he now moved like someone who had something to protect again. Someone who belonged. A breeze passed through, light and playful, lifting a leaf across the porch. Bronx followed it with his eyes, ears perked. Then, out of nowhere, a scrawny gray cat darted across the lawn, tail high and twitching. Bronx tried to leap after it. Tried. His front legs moved with purpose, but the rest of him didn't follow. He flopped sideways with a dull thump, landing in an undignified heap beside Luna's feet. For a moment there was silence. Then Luna burst out laughing, loud, unfiltered, full of joy. The kind of laugh that shakes your shoulders and draws tears from your eyes. She clutched her stomach, leaned back, and gasped, "Rusty, you're too old to be chasing cats." Walter paused, looked over, and started laughing too. "Maybe," he said, shaking his head, "but he already caught the hearts of 2 stubborn humans. I'd say that's enough." Bronx huffed in agreement, tongue lolling, eyes proud despite the fall. He didn't get the cat, but he got something better: laughter, love, and the kind of peace you can only find after a long, hard journey. As the sun climbed higher, the 3 of them settled into the moment. No more running, no more hiding. Just the soft creak of a rocking chair, the scratch of pencil on paper, the scent of fresh-cut grass, and a dog stretched out across the porch with nothing left to prove and everything finally in its right place. And if someone were to walk by and glance up at the old house, they might see an old man, a little girl, and a dog who had once been a soldier. But if they looked closer, they'd see something more. 3 broken hearts stitched back together, not with words, but with quiet mornings, shared silence, and the kind of love that doesn't ask questions, just stays. If you've made it here, thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering that love comes in many forms, even on four unsteady legs. Bronx may never chase another cat, but in the quiet laughter of a little girl and the softened gaze of a war-torn man, he found something better than speed. He found meaning. At Vale Marks, we believe stories like this matter. If it touched you, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and help this small channel grow by hitting that subscribe button. Your support means the world. It's what keeps these stories alive. As the old saying goes, not all heroes wear capes, some just refuse to leave. Let's make sure their stories are never forgotten.